Welcome to the DTN Ag Summit. I'm your host, Katie Dellinger. I'm the farm business editor here at DTN Progressive Farmer. Our theme this year is planning for success, and I think our content today is going to be really important and helpful for you all on the farm getting ready to do that for 2026. We know that this past growing season has been an interesting one. We put out a massive corn and soybean crop. We'll be hearing a little bit next week from the USDA as to how big they think that is and what the implications of that October shutdown really meant for the WASU report. We'll get a better feel for that next week when the updated numbers come out from USDA. But as we look forward to what we're going to talk about here today, we're going to start off with a weather forecast from DTN Ag meteorologist John Baranick. He's going to talk a little bit about the La Nina conditions, but what that might look like for spring, if it's going to be the same or if there might be a little bit different in the long range model forecast. That's something that John will explain a lot for you guys as to what we do at DTN and how we arrive at that information. We've got a really different process here than some other ag weather forecasters out there that you may see. And then when John is done, we're going to bring in our lead analyst, Rhett Montgomery. He's going to talk about the grain markets, specifically corn, soybeans, wheat. He's going to talk those supply and demand balance sheets. He's going to explain a little bit about USDA and give some, insight as to prices, where they could be headed in 2026. And then when we're done with that, we'll have a joint Q&A with John and Rhett. So please, as we're going along, drop those questions into the Q&A and I'll make sure I bring those up at the end of our program when we all get together to really talk through everything that we've discussed during the day. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce DTN Ag Meteorologist John Baranick. John, welcome back to the Ag Summit.
Hey, yeah, good to be with us. It's kind of nice being remote this time because it's so dang cold up here. We hit below 10 below this morning, so I
Whoa.
know a lot of us had some pretty chilly weather this morning.
Is that unusually chilly for you guys? I know you're up in Minnesota, so
Yeah.
cold is cold, but
Yeah, cold is normal, but usually we don't get this cold until we turn the calendar over into the new year. So having this happen here in December is pretty cold.
yeah, it's chilly here, but I really can't complain. I live in the Nashville area, so 35, I'm all right. I'm not freezing yet.
It's still a little colder than normal down there, and this December is shaping up to be kind of a chilly one. Some minor interruptions in that. We'll talk about that in a bit.
Yeah, but plenty of snow so far this year, which is a good thing if you need the moisture.
We'll see. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of folks that have seen some of the heavy snow so far, which has extended all the way into Missouri and Illinois, even south of the Ohio River, has gotten some significant snow here. I think a lot of folks would rather see that as rain this time of year, but I guess get the moisture when you can get it.
Yeah. Well, I know what little bit we got around here melted real quick, so we'll see how long it sticks too.
That's right. And we'll go through that here. So I guess I'll take it away. And yeah, I mean, we'll start with kind of where we're at. I mean, we've kind of done this song and dance with me if you've been here on our Ag Summits before. We'll talk about where we're at, what the next seasons are headed towards, but why they're headed that way as well. And then we'll talk about South America. And yes, for Kent, I do have some stuff on Western Canada to pipe in there at the end as well. So we'll get through all of that. And of course, if this wants to advance, there we go. So, over the fall season, it was actually a very warm fall season overall. If you added up every day from September 1st through the end of November, averaged it all out, very warm across the majority of the U.S., but specifically in the plains, in the really the middle of the country. We did have obviously some cold air intrusions at times, and we saw some early frosts in the northern plains up in September, but it was a very warm season overall. Also very active for the western half of the country, and specifically down in California in the Southwest. They had a couple of really big systems down there that have helped to reduce some of the drought, but also very active across the northern and central plains as well. Not everywhere, but there's some definite winners out there in terms of precipitation and building some soil moisture going into the winter season. And also we had a somewhat active pattern there across the Ohio and Tennessee Valley. So right along and just north of the Ohio River, down south through Kentucky and Tennessee, has seen some decent precipitation there. throughout the fall season. Not so much in the first half, but definitely in the second half to kind of reduce some of that drought. So we ended the season on a fairly dry note. I know this is September for the fall, but that's still one of our growing seasons, and we didn't end in the greatest of shape in a lot of areas. But some areas were able to build in some soil moisture here over the second half of the fall. So looking at our drought monitor, it just updated this morning. We've got still plenty of drought across large portions of the country, but it's been reduced across a lot of portions as well, specifically in the West. Once you get to the Rockies and areas west, I mean, there are hardly any areas out there that have seen some degradation in the drought over the last 3 months. Most of that's improvement, and some of that massive improvement, specifically in those areas that saw the heavy rain in Southern California and the Southwest. But even portions of Southern Colorado, which is still in the mountains and not a huge impact for us in ag territory, but there's some areas out there, I suppose, that saw some massive improvements. We've seen some early snow to start building up in there, and that's putting us on a better footpath for that. For those that in the plains specifically that rely on some of that moisture coming down there, but also across some portions of Nebraska down into Missouri have seen some improvement. Again, along and just south of the Ohio River have seen some improvement, but just everywhere else, this is kind of uh, looks a little bit worse than it really is. A lot of this drought in the upper Midwest was put on early on in the fall season, and we've been kind of able to chip away at some of that, at least over the last several weeks. Texas and the Southeast have been kind of on a drier path, but some better precipitation last week over Texas. Some heavy rain there has helped to improve conditions there. And then other portions of the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast have seen kind of variable conditions, but mostly on the drier side during the fall season. So we're kind of in a mixed shape right now. There's some areas out there that really need the moisture. Some of those, as Katie mentioned, got some really good moisture with some heavy snow across Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, uh, and Michigan and Wisconsin. So a foot of snow is going to help, and the ground should have been fairly warm, relatively speaking, enough to melt it from below to help really that soak in to the soil column. So that will be helpful, and eventually, we'll see that melting and getting into the soil column as well. So overall, that moisture will be helpful, but there's still a long way to go for some of these areas, especially in Illinois and northern Indiana and Northwest Ohio, where we see some of that D3 drought, and across the far southeast as well, northern Florida into southern Alabama and Georgia, where things are quite dramatically terrible right now as well. But elsewhere is just kind of patchy, and we'll see how this fall season goes. In terms of soil moisture, I mean, this is assuming that all that snow is on top of the soils right now and not penetrating it. So, I mean, this is taken from satellite, so that they just kind of make some assumptions about the snow cover once the snow's there, and they set the soil moisture is frozen until that changes. So we won't see improvements in the soil moisture there across Iowa through Michigan for a little while yet till we start to see some of that melting. And it might take a while as well. We'll have to see on that, but we'll talk about that in a little bit here. So, before we start talking about the actual forecast and what goes into it, I mean, what's really important is to understand just what affects our weather, specifically about the winter season. And there's, four different categories we lump things into. The biggest one there is ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. The warm side of that being El Nino, the cold side of that being La Nina. And models have gotten really, really good actually at forecasting this several months out. We were talking about La Nina coming, it's here, but we were talking about this coming actually 2 years ago, basically due on history, and the models really started picking up on it at the end of their model runs, which were happening almost a year ago. So models have gotten actually really good at forecasting that. Not, but that's only 40% of basically what happens on a day-to-day basis. There's a lot of other things that go into the weather forecast as well. The other big portion of that is what goes on with the polar vortex. We'll talk about that a bit, but we don't have a great skill at forecasting that just yet. It's kind of odd, and we'll talk about it a little bit, but there's two parts of the polar vortex. One that's doing our day-to-day weather. It spins around. It's connected to the surface and what we call the troposphere. And there's one actually that extends higher up into the atmosphere, into the stratosphere. And that is a lot of what gets the attention on weather forecasts and blogs and stuff going out. When people talk about disruptions to the polar vortex, they're usually talking about the stratospheric polar vortex. And that doesn't always have connection to the surface. We'll talk about that a little bit. So we only have some fair skill at describing that. Usually within the next 4 weeks or so, we have a decent idea of what's going to happen with that and how that might affect us here at the surface. Everything else can kind of be lumped into the last two categories. One, subseasonal factors. That could be anything from thunderstorms in the tropics to ocean temperatures and how they change across the rest of the world. Cloud cover and snow cover, which, obviously, if you're underneath a blanket of snow right now, you've got some colder air next to you than somebody who doesn't. And that can affect your weather on a day-to-day basis, holding down those temperatures. And the other category is what I like to call momentum. And you can think about that as a couple of things. One, climate change, and two, kind of where are we now kind of dictates what happens, where we're going to go tomorrow. So if today is cold, tomorrow's likely to be cold as well. So that you can think about that on a day-to-day time frame. You can think about that on a week-to-week, month-to-month, season-to-season, year-to-year. They all have some sort of momentum to them. And that obviously is just history, so we have obviously good skill at doing that. But all those other little things, the day-to-day thunderstorms, those little systems that move through that can't be seen weeks out, the things that are only able to be seen on a day-to-day basis, we can only see maybe a week or two out in advance. So we have low skill at that, and that can play some big impacts. So when we talk about the seasonal forecast, you got to think about it as a kind of a general idea. We've got good skill at what La Nina is going to do for us in the future. Fairly decent idea of what's going to happen with the polar vortex, but all those day-to-day things are going to mess with it too. And so let's dive into it. All right, here's Monday's information on what's happening with El Nino, or I'm sorry, La Nina. That black box here in the lower left is showing you the area we look at for describing what's going on with La Nina. It is a small box, but it's very important and has been proven to really give us a good idea of what's going on in the atmosphere. And we're sitting at a minus 0.6 degrees Celsius. That's just below the minus 0.5 needed to classify as La Nina. So we're in a very weak La Nina at the moment. And if you go to the right here where the arrow is, you can see kind of how this has changed over time. So last year in the wintertime, we peaked out in January into February, late January into February, came very quickly up to neutral conditions and bounced around neutral throughout the spring and summer. And that's why we had such variable weather conditions during those seasons. But when we got to the end of summer and into fall, we really started to get into La Nina conditions. That's partially why we started to dry out. But now we're starting to peak here in late November and early December. And so this is a little bit different from last year. Last year we were peaking at the second half of winter. This year we're peaking at the first half of winter. You can see all those cold water temperatures there along the equator. The black box is again where we designate where we spend our focus, but you can see that water temperatures there, surface water temperatures there from on the right side is South America, and on the left side is Indonesia. And you can see Australia in the lower left-hand corner there. I mean, basically from the South American coastline all the way to the international date line, we have cold water across the equator there, and that's impacting our weather patterns here for at least the next couple of months. What's interesting though is if we look down deeper through the ocean, right at the top of the map, there is the surface water and everything below it is just going down deeper. And just off the coast of Australia, and it's starting to move its way eastward, is this pool of very warm water. And it's been gathering there over the last couple of months and has been slowly building its way eastward. Models have that, and I don't have the loop for it here. It doesn't really work too well on PowerPoint. But the loop here shows this blob of warm water continuing to migrate eastward over the next few months. It's going to take some time. I mean, it's a slow process, but over the next couple of months, this warm water is expected to really eliminate that pool of cold water, not only at the surface, but also below. So we're going to have some features here, not only with this water, but also with the winds at the surface that are going to help to really eliminate this La Nina in a quick way. And so the models are picking up on this really quickly here. And this here's our American climate model. I show this one first all the time because honestly, it's the best one at capturing what's going on with ENSO. And you can see over the summertime here, we had some fairly neutral conditions. We crossed that threshold into La Nina in October, and we're starting to peak here at the end of November and into December. And we're going to quickly move up into neutral there for the second half of winter. So La Nina is here, but it's going to be both 1 week and two short-lived. So this isn't something new. We've been talking about this for months. If we were at any of the farm shows where I've been speaking, or I think our last Ag Summit Series event, I was talking about a short-lived La Nina event, and models haven't deviated from that just yet. So we've got kind of a short period here in the early portions of the winter, but as we get deeper into the winter and we get into spring, we could be on the verge of El Nino during the later half of spring and into summer. We'll have to keep our eye on that. You can see there's a lot of spread, and models have the lowest skill of forecast verification once we get into the springtime there. So once we get past, say, March, we'll have a better idea what's going to happen during the spring, but or the rest of spring and especially the summer. But we have an idea here where we're not going to be headed back to La Nina conditions next summer. History would suggest that this second La Nina in a row here after last year's would be the final one. And we could go basically anywhere from there, from cold side of neutral, which is just below the 0 degree line, up into an El Nino. So we'll have to keep our eyes on it. It's something that's going to be changing, and it's something that's really going to impact the weather going forward. But we just don't have the skill at it after we get past about March. So there's a lot of spread in there, and we'll have to keep that in mind. And it's going to impact our forecast going forward. Not to be outdone, the international models are also having the same idea, maybe not the same magnitude as the American model, but they have us peaking here just below the La Nina threshold in December, and then slowly working our way up through neutral over the rest of the winter, and then into the warm side of neutral there during the spring and especially the summer. So they're a little bit more delayed. They're not as dramatic with the temperature changes in the ocean as the American model is, but show the same idea. And so since we have the same idea of a very front-loaded La Nina winter, that's what we've been going with for actually quite a while now, and what we are expecting here for the season. So, okay, what does that mean? And I've showed this image quite a few times, but it's good to show again. Is really what La Nina does is it has a big effect on our jet stream, and it splits it. So it comes off the coast of Asia there, kind of splits into two pieces. The polar jet stream goes north into Alaska. You see this big ridge over the North Pacific into Alaska, and kind of what goes up must come down. Not always, but usually that's what we see. And we'll see this jet stream then diving down south across Canada and then into the northern US. At the same time, we get the southern split of that, the Pacific jet stream, to kind of move across almost west to east and kind of join up with that once it gets into the US plains. Brings a lot of wet weather to the Pacific Northwest. And then once those two kind of combine across the US, we see this storm track basically from Texas up into the Northeast on a lot of these storm systems. So bringing up a whole bunch of precipitation from the Gulf, we see the storm track across the Ohio Valley pick up a lot of moisture, and some of those areas are still deep in drought, so that would be good to see. Well, we get a lot of cold air coming down from Canada and across the northern U.S., and we've already seen that here since Thanksgiving. And so we'll continue to probably see that here as long as La Nina has some significant influence. The other part will be the polar vortex, and this is an okay image. It does an okay job of describing what's going on. But on the left here, you see what would be a stronger and more stable polar vortex. The jet stream that circles the cold air around the North Pole basically doesn't move a whole lot. There may be some wiggles in there, but generally it contains a lot of the cold air up towards the pole, and it keeps us across the US and Canada fairly mild. Well, the air then comes off the Pacific instead of coming down from the Arctic. However, we can get some disruptions to the polar vortex. And you'll notice here, especially on the left side of the right-hand graph there, where we've got this red arrow coming up across the Pacific, with the polar jet stream there from La Nina bumping up into Alaska, that can cause some disruptions to the polar vortex. It already hasn't resulted in the cold air we're seeing now, but it may have some impact later on. We'll talk about that a little bit, but overall, it's kind of hard to describe here. But usually, what we see is this warmer air pushing up through Alaska, dislodging or splitting the polar vortex into multiple pieces, and that cold air then moves down south, either across here in North America, but doesn't have to. It can push over into Europe or Asia, could go anywhere, and kind of depends on just how strong these pushes are and a lot of different factors we don't need to go into. But just to say that disruptions to the polar vortex can bring a lot of that Arctic air down south towards us. And that's why we hear a lot about it during the course of a winter season. It's because that's one way to get a lot of cold air down. But when we talk about this, we're usually talking about the stratosphere, and the stratosphere doesn't have that uh, exact connection to the troposphere and the surface all the time. So, we can get something like this where we get a split in the polar vortex. This is the black box in the upper right shows us this is what's forecast for next Saturday. We get a part of the polar vortex there to move down into Canada, eastern Canada, and that is an arm splitting of the polar vortex. But at the exact same time, look at the surface temperatures there. That's not very cold air sitting underneath that. And that's actually pretty warm air there in Hudson Bay and just coming off of Greenland. So this splitting of the polar vortex isn't going to be what's going to cause all this cold air. And you can see all the greens and blues coming from Alaska southeast through Canada and into the eastern US. That's going to be due to something different. So just because we have a disruption to the polar vortex and we're going to get some colder air doesn't mean that the two are related. So there are some things out there that you might want to be mindful of every so often when you hear about the polar vortex. Just because you hear polar vortex doesn't mean it's cold, and just because it's cold doesn't mean it's due to the polar vortex. So what other things affect our weather? And I've showed this one multiple times. We don't have to go through all these, or really anyone. The one on the third one there, the AO, the Arctic Oscillation, that's the polar vortex that has some big impacts. Other things are just ocean temperatures around the world. Honestly, have big impacts on our weather. They add energy to the atmosphere, and if you look at some of the ocean temperatures there around the world, you can see the La Nina very prominently across the Pacific. But there's a lot of red on this map. And this has been persistent really for the last couple of years, where we've got a lot of extra energy in the oceans right now, and that's leading to extra energy in the atmosphere. So partially why we've had some, to go along with the neutral conditions over the spring and summer, we've also had a lot of energy coming from all the rest of the world's oceans and causing things to go kind of haywire as well. As long as we have a lot of areas that are very lopsided here, and another one of those being just off the coast of Australia there in the Pacific, which is going to be the end of our La Nina eventually here. We're going to see a whole bunch of disruptions to the pattern. So La Nina will be there. It will have a big impact on our weather, but it's not going to be a consistent pattern here day to day. There's other things going on that we need to be mindful of. So here we go into the winter forecast. Add it all up, December 1st, so we're already into it. through February, not a leap year, so 28th. We're expecting a very cold winter here across the northern tier of the U.S. A lot of that is kind of weighted by what's going on already here in December. A little bit warmer across the south. The precipitation pattern, again, favoring the Pacific Northwest and the Northern Rockies, and also the Ohio Valley. A little bit mixed in between. And I think the more interesting thing here is the drier periods across California, across the Southern Plains, those areas with winter wheat and other winter crops could have some issues there where, we've been kind of teetering around with drought a little bit here this fall. We might be kind of pushing our way into that here. Again, though, I like to do, let's go month by month. And December is obviously the cold period. I mean, we already talked about how I'm 10 below this morning, and we've had all that snowpack there. We've really built it in. It's going to be hard to get rid of, honestly. We'll get some warmer air coming in next week, but it's probably going to be brief. Probably see a little bit of melting of the snowpack that's out there, especially for those across Iowa and Illinois into Indiana. But just how much of that melts away is going to be interesting to see, because the weather pattern is shaping up to bring us some more loaded areas of cold air here for the rest of the month. So while we'll get a little bit of a break next week, we'll see those warm temperatures out in the west kind of leak out into the plains, and then hopefully a little bit farther east kind of get rid of some of this cold air. Looks like we will be turning back into the Arctic depths there at the end of December, possibly into early January as well. A lot of that is coming with clipper systems, and while the Pacific Northwest, you can see there on the December map, shows some enhanced precipitation, some really heavy rain and snow up there that should help with drought situation, possibly leaking into the Rockies and some areas into the high plains up there. It's a lot of clipper systems, and clippers love to produce streaks of precipitation that are heavy in some areas and very light or non-existent in others. So we could be, while we have some, spots up there that are green and red across the northern tier of the country, it's probably just mixed conditions, honestly. We've got better chances for those clippers producing some better precipitation there in the northern plains. As they get into the Great Lakes, it's a little questionable. And then, honestly, it's cold air moving across the Great Lakes to produce some enhanced lake effect snow that's causing a lot of that increased precipitation there over the eastern Great Lakes. So that's going to be kind of the main primary period here for the rest of December. So we get into January, we probably see some more disruptions to the polar vortex. And we'll see how that one that occurs next week may have some impacts later on down the line going into January. And we do have some pretty darn cold temperatures there across the eastern 2/3 of the country there going into January. If you're looking up into the Canadian prairies, for some reason, our forecast has some warmer temperatures getting into Western Canada. I don't quite believe that to be true. Honestly, I think if we've got cold air across the Midwest and the East, we're going to get it over Western Canada as well. That's going to be the source region for it. So I don't necessarily believe that, but that is the DTN forecast. The colder air, though, during January going all the way to the Gulf would suppress the jet stream and the storm track across the south. So we have some better chances for precipitation there, possibly frozen for some of those across the southern half of the country. So we'll watch and see if any of the snow gets farther south in January. But then something interesting happens really in February. And as La Nina relaxes and those temperatures start coming back up towards neutral, we're going to start to see a shift in the weather pattern from getting these frequent bursts of cold air to get blocked a little bit by a ridge developing in the southeast U.S. And the stronger that is, the more it's going to push back to the northwest that cold. So still anticipating, unfortunately, for those of us in Western Canada, the Northern Plains up in the Midwest, myself included, looks like a cold end to the winter yet, but we've got some warmer air then working across the south and southeast. That then sets up this baroclinic zone where we got cold temperatures north, warm temperatures south, and the storm track loves to go right through that. And that sets up basically our Texas and Oklahoma to the northeast storm track. really bringing about the increased precipitation across the Ohio Valley. That includes a lot of the drought areas there that missed out, but also some of those areas that aren't in drought. And so we might have some wetter conditions going into spring. We'll have to be a little bit concerned about that. Across the southern plains, it'll be tough. While the storm track starts around Texas, it doesn't necessarily mean that Texas will get a whole bunch of precipitation. It could be that it just gathers there and then really starts to increase as it goes northeast. So the southern plains end up in actually a poor condition of dryness, and we might have to worry about some of those with winter wheat down there. In terms of snowfall, constant clippers, cold air, lake effect snow that leads to above normal snowfall forecast there across the northern tier of the country. A little bit less there in the central and southern Rockies through the southern plains, but notice that secondary kind of burst there across the Ohio Valley. That's really towards the second half of winter. And it's really going to depend on just how cold those temperatures are. But if the storm track is frequent through there, we can expect to see some snow at times. I'm sure we'll get some cold air to come down. That should increase that as well. So we may have, for some of those across the south, some of those ice storms turning into snow, and then farther north, some heavier snow. A lot of us up in the northern plains needed to build some snowpack because over the last couple of seasons has been really poor in that regard. So it'd be great to see some additional snowpack here and give us some soil moisture going into the spring season. You can extend that going up into Western Canada as well. A lot of those clipper systems like to produce plenty of snowfall up there as well. Less of a chance for that melting away. So we'll probably have some snowpack going into spring of next year. So here's a spring forecast, and I won't spend nearly as much time on this because it's a little bit uncertain, especially later in the spring, with those conditions either heading up towards El Nino or not. And that's going to be a big difference here in the forecast. But a lot of this is kind of hangover from the February, and especially as we get into March and April, we see that cold air kind of lingering around. Another storm track kind of up that way across the northern tier of the country. That could be beneficial for a lot of us up in the northern tier that do have some drought and need some moisture. Might come as snow, and it might be a little bit tough to get out there early and work. But getting some moisture, I think, is a little bit more important than getting planted exactly on time. You might disagree with that, but I think that's how the plants will probably see it. April's going to be interesting, though, and this is where our focus kind of turns from of more certainty in March to less certainty in April. And April's, been one of those months over the last couple of decades, honestly, that's been colder than normal. We've seen kind of the shift in temperature start later in the winter season and end later in the spring season. Now this year we're not getting that. We're getting a cold start to winter. But many Aprils over the last decade have been much colder than normal there across especially the northern tier of the US. So we might see some cold hangover there, but a lot less certain. What's even less certain then is the flip to May and a very warm temperature pattern. As we get into the spring season, it looks awfully variable, which may or may not be a good thing. Just depending on what our situation is coming from the winter, if we're dry in the southern plains, an active spring would be great for getting moisture in there for winter wheat. We might have to worry a little bit more about severe weather season. We'll have to see how that kind of plays into it. And those across the southeast that get dry here are dealing with drought may have some better conditions there going into summer. But if we do end up on the summer path towards an El Nino, at least in the neutral category, that does promote a more active weather pattern across the bulk of the country. So I threw this on here because I think I owe it to everybody to just kind of show what our forecast is for the summer, but I expect a lot of changes to this, honestly. As we know a little bit more about where El Nino is going for next year, we can kind of pay a little bit more attention to what the patterns might be, which areas may have some heat issues, which areas may have some drought issues. I think what we should take away from it right now is that if we expect an El Nino or at least warm side of neutral pattern, we should expect a highly variable weather pattern across the bulk of the country next summer. And if that's the case, there's going to be some winners and losers to that. Our forecast at the moment, with the years we're choosing to use and the models that exist out at that length of time, kind of paint the western half of the Corn Belt as drier, same with the Canadian prairies, and a lot wetter along the Mississippi River eastward. But I'm not so confident that the years we have that show up for this winter that show some pretty good confluence and continuity over the winter will be that way once we get to summer. I'm sure we'll have some changes to that as we move forward. So I'll put this here. I'm not going to go through it month by month, but just to say that we should see a more, at least an active summer season, and we'll just have to see which areas will get it. It's going to depend on how deep we get into El Nino, where the drought is from the spring, and things like that. So we'll know more about that as we get into our next one here over the spring. Okay, so let's talk about South America as well, because that's our major source of competition. Rhett's going to possibly talk about some of that going on. And La Nina doesn't just affect us here in the US, it does affect really the entire globe, but specifically in South America, leaves Argentina and southern Brazil in a drier situation. Not so much in central Brazil, but that has been the case so far. So this spring season has been actually god awful for those in central and northern Brazil. Up until this week, they've had some rather poor weather conditions. It's been very dry, and since it hasn't been raining a whole lot, it's been very hot. So soil moisture has been really poor. We'll look at that in just a second. But some of these areas in central Brazil are running at 40% or lower average precipitation for the last 3 months. As you get into southern Brazil and Argentina, it has been a little bit on the dry side, especially the last couple of weeks. But they've been having some frequent precipitation move through, and over the course of the early spring, it was even better. So soil moisture there, when you look on the right hand side there, I have circled the areas that are most impacted, or the most heavily agricultural areas of both countries. And you can see the soil moisture across Argentina and going into southern Brazil is actually pretty darn good at the moment. They've gone through some rather dry stretches over the last couple of weeks, but in between that, they've been hit by some fronts that have been sweeping through with some widespread precipitation. So soil moisture is okay for now. We might see that dropping, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But look at central and northern Brazil. The soil moisture there is absolutely garbage. This isn't compared to normal. This is just soil moisture overall. So it's really insufficient across a large portions of areas that are heavy soybean producers that will get into corn once we turn the calendar. And so their soybeans are not doing great at the moment. I haven't heard or seen a lot of disruption to some of the soybeans down there just yet. And they have been getting some rain. It hasn't been coming at the same clip, but it might be just enough where the soybeans are looking okay at the moment. And a lot of those early planted soybeans are getting into the blooming and pod setting stage. So the rainfall coming up is going to be very important. And what's happening this week for them is rather good. I'm not going to go through the summer season forecast month by month, but the rainfall forecast, honestly, going forward for central Brazil is favorable. So if they've done okay or okay enough through now, the rainfall going forward here for the rest of December and January, which is the pod fill stages, should end up with a decent soybean crop for them. There have been some issues, but I don't think it's going to be that big of an issue going forward for them. If they're not building up soil moisture, though, that could come into play with their safrinha season there. And that's where we're a little bit more concerned about it. But I mean, look at that dry signal over Argentina and southern Brazil. Not only for the rest of this month, which looks to be the same as we've seen the last couple of weeks, long stretches of dryness with a front coming through with showers. It has been so far a lot more consistent and widespread, but over the next couple of weeks, it looks to become a little bit more patchy. Models have not been doing a great job of that, so we'll see if that actually comes to fruition. But the signal is for worsening conditions over Argentina and southern Brazil over the next several months. So while conditions are looking good there right now, we're going to have to pay very close attention to those areas specifically over the next couple of months. And, you know, one of the really interesting issues then with La Nina is what it does to the wet season in central Brazil, where they do the double cropping with soybeans and then corn. And a lot of those, I've showed this quite a few times as well, but during La Nina years, you see a lot of those blue circles on the left-hand side of the red line, which means that wet season ends earlier on average during the La Nina than not. So we could be looking at some issues here. We've had significant dryness. Some folks were planted later than they'd like to be across central Brazil with their soybeans. If we have any disruption with the wetness keeping folks out of their fields for harvesting their soybeans, and we have this protracted end to the wet season, we could see some issues with that corn crop as well. So soybeans, I don't think will be as impacted as corn, at least in central Brazil. Farther south, it's both crops. So we have some dangers out there for them. And I think that's, I guess, good news here going forward for us, that even though they look good right now, we could tip those scales in a hurry over the next couple of months. Getting into that fall season, then we showcase primarily across central Brazil, where we have drier conditions there to end their season. So not a great end to their season. Maybe okay over Argentina and southern Brazil, where they're still filling some of those later crops and getting ready for their winter wheat situation. But overall, we're looking at central Brazil here, and it looks a lot drier in the March and April time periods. So that gives us at least some hope for prices going forward. Doesn't mean that it will happen, but it means we've got some reason for hope in that. And then for Kent, I know who's up there in the Canadian prairies, and anyone else up there, just a little bit more focus on them. A lot like the Northern Plains, very cold, clippery. So we're building some soil moisture, maybe a little bit more in Alberta than other areas. But when we get to spring, it gets a lot more variable. And if we didn't build up a good snowpack, we could have some lingering cold early on in the season. It flips a little bit, maybe late. We'll see how that works itself out. But if we get a good snowpack down, we should have some soil moisture there for planting season for that spring wheat crop, canola, all those other crops up there. So that's all I have for today. We're going to hold off the Q&A until after Rhett. I'll send it back to the studio. But Katie, if anybody's out there wants to get in contact with me, I love getting emails from folks asking about your situation, what's coming up in the future. Just send me an email. I love chatting with people. That's my favorite part. This is the worst part about being remote, doing these remote, is we're not able to talk to folks directly. But you can still talk to me through the email.
Thanks, John. That's something that we talked a little bit about with Shaylee yesterday, that the analysts here at DTN are really great about getting everyone involved involved in talking. We are an independent source of news, weather, and market advice. We are not trying to sell anything other than our services for news mostly. And we are really working on a number of interesting things here at DTN. I see we're still waiting a little bit for Rhett to join us. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions here, John. Are we going to have a white Christmas?
Well, we've got a really good opportunity to do that for a lot of us that have already gotten the snow. And it's going to take, a lot of folks there from Iowa to Michigan, large portions of the northern half of Illinois and into Indiana got a foot of snow, or 6 to 12 inches of snow. That doesn't melt very easily in December when we don't have a very high sun angle, or much hope for warm temperatures the rest of this month. So if you've got the snow, you've probably got a good chance of having a white Christmas. There is some interesting things when we get that cold air to come back at the end of the month. It's probably going to happen before Christmas starts. And to usher in some more cold air usually means a big system coming through. So we have opportunities for those that don't have snow on the ground right now to get some, or those that have it to get a little bit more.
Okay, and I want to encourage everyone, if you've got questions for John, drop them in the Q&A section so we can answer them when John comes back to join us after Rhett gives his presentation. John, thank you for that information. We'll bring you back on in a little bit. Next up, we're going to bring in DTN lead analyst Rhett Montgomery. Rhett is located down in Norman, Oklahoma, but he's got a history all across the Corn Belt, grew up in Nebraska, and has done a lot of work in the grain merchandising side. Rhett, welcome back to the Ag Summit.
Good morning, Katie. Thank you. Good to be back at the Egg Summit, especially after fortunately missing the last one in August. But the good news for me is that we had Todd Holtman back at the desk for that one, and he got to be the bearer of the bad news in August when we were hitting our seasonal lows in commodity prices. A little more reason for optimism in my mind as we look to end 2025 and turn the corner into 2026. So we'll cover all that and more here to talk about the grain markets. But I'd just like to say a great 2 days of the Egg Summit. I've really enjoyed the discussions thus far, and I look forward to sharing some insights into the grain.
And I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I know it's been a rough year for a lot of producers psychologically dealing with another year of low prices and the cash flow crunches that tend to come with that. So please go ahead and take it away. Let us know what you're seeing on corn, soybeans, and wheat.
Absolutely. Thank you, Katie. And thanks everyone for joining us as well. As Katie said, I'm Rhett Montgomery. We'll go ahead and just dive right into it here. I titled my presentation, Can Prices Turn the Corner in 2026? It certainly feels, as I alluded to, that we've maybe begun to see an emerging post-harvest rally, similar to maybe what we saw in 2020. Of course, we'll want to see, what kind of legs this rally has compared to 2024, 2025, which of course topped out in a kind of weird way in February, which is very odd to see. So with that, we'll jump right in. Just like to start with some big picture factors always. Highlighted in red are maybe some bearish aspects to keep an eye on as we round out 2025. The number one thing is that across the globe, we've really seen very strong and in many cases record crops for corn, soybeans, and especially wheat. We'll look closely into this, especially in the wheat market. A little bit of bearish news even this morning with the Statistics Canada report finding a record wheat production in Canada as well to add to record level supplies around the globe there. Second, trade with China remains a question mark. We'll take a look at this from both lenses, a bearish and a bullish lens. Of course, with China returning in the last month to the U.S. market, perhaps some reason for optimism there, but still a hazy outlook, to put it that way. U.S. prices, as a result of the rallies, especially in soybeans, have caught up to competitors around the globe. Kind of unseasonable as well to see U.S. prices higher than Brazil in terms of export offers, especially just following our harvest is a little rare to see. So we'll take a look at that as well here and where the U.S. sits in world soybean and corn trade as well. On the bullish side, something to watch out here is the return of the inflation trade potentially. We have seen this at times through the 2025 year. It seems to have been kind of hit or miss, especially as the Federal Reserve has begun to lower interest rates. I believe the latest probability reading on the CME FedWatch tool was for 88% chance that there's another rate cut here in the December Federal Reserve meeting. It will really depend after the first of the year when Fed Chair Powell's term is up and whoever Donald Trump appoints as the leader of the Fed. If they get even more aggressive with the interest rate cuts, could see a corner of the investment world turn to commodities as a hedge against perceived inflation. That was a big driver, of course, in the commodity rally at the turn of 2020 and 2021 post-COVID world. Not necessarily saying it'll be that intense. I think we're kind of in a different landscape now, but definitely something to keep an eye on. Second, demand for U.S. crops is record strong, both domestically and abroad. As I mentioned, we'll take a look at some finer detailed charts in terms of competitiveness for corn and soybeans and wheat. Seasonality as well is currently in the favor of the bulls. As I mentioned, we're in a very similar situation to what we saw in 2024 towards the end of the year, where we really saw that rally take off kind of in the middle of December. And of course, went to go on over the next 2 months before topping out kind of in the middle of February. Once we started to get a little bit of tariff concern in the mix, kind of drove those prices lower. So jumping to the commodities individually, we'll start with corn. just to kind of recap where we've been, as Katie alluded to, certainly a painful area to be in terms of corn profitability. There are some silver linings, though, to find in this chart. I think you'll find that I like to be a glass half full kind of guy when it comes to this. It's just there's no denying it. It's been a rough few years. We really haven't had a chance, as you can see by the last few years of profitability. Basically, this is just taking the high for the DTN National Corn Index, the average of U.S. cash prices, and dividing it by the USDA cost of production estimate. So, of course, cost of production, it varies from farmer to farm and state to state, as we know. But this is kind of just a weighted average of that to give a good, holistic look at where we're sitting in terms of corn profitability on the grand scheme. But you can see that's about 30% below USDA cost production historically seems to be a floor, outside of the late 1990s were a tough period for that. But maybe a reason for optimism thus far for this marketing year. You can see we are setting a higher floor than we have the last 2 years. Still haven't gotten that upside potential, but it is worth noting that the National Corn Index did hit its high for the year just this week on Tuesday, and that was 16% below USDA cost of production. So still a ways to go to be at a break even, but feels like we're maybe starting to head in the right direction. Jumping into the fundamental outlook here, looking at corn production, it's most likely at this point going to end up as a record U.S. corn crop, at least in the eyes of the USDA. But I always like to do some exercise to see, okay, just how much can we anticipating it varying from the last estimate put out by the government. I would implore anyone who looks at the WASDE each month to jump to page, I think it's 36, 37 or something like that, where the USDA is very forthcoming with their historical errors. So I've circled the 90% confidence interval. So to get to 90% or an A on a college scale confidence, you can expect plus or minus 2.3% from the USDA's November estimate. So just to break that down, in November, USDA essentially said 90 million acres of harvested for corn. That is the largest going back to, I believe, 1934 or something, almost 100 years. So that's really the root of the supply here as we move through the harvest. Also, a record strong yield still at 186 bushels per acre. That's where I'm a little skeptical still. We'll talk about that more. Leads to just under a 17 billion bushel crop, 16.75 billion bushels. If you do the math on that, plus 2.3%, bring it up to over 17 billion. I don't necessarily would believe this side, just with some of the reports we'd heard through the fall. I tend to err more towards the minus 2.3%. That would bring the yield down to 182 bushels per acre. That seems a lot more reasonable in my mind, given some of the reports we'd heard, both from plot tests as well as just reports from around the Midwest, especially with the southern rust problem through the late summer and early fall. Either way, though, looking at a record crop, even if we drop this much, it's still a record crop by over 1 billion bushels. So definitely a large amount of supply here entering the market following this 2025 harvest. But with those high supplies comes very stellar demand thus far, especially on the export side of things. As you can see, as indicated by the green line, and I apologize, this data would normally be more recent, but due to the government shutdown, we only have the data up to October 30th at this point. We do have inspection space more recent, which is as of last week, we're up 72% on export inspections. But just looking at this chart, you can see if we follow a typical seasonality, it really points to above and beyond what the USDA is even anticipating. They are saying we will export over 3 billion bushels of corn in 2025-26. That would be a record, would break the record set just last year. So we're looking at potentially at back-to-back record export years. Just a testament to the demand for U.S. corn, especially going just south to Mexico. The U.S. very fortunate to be the neighbors to the north to, a country in Mexico that is among the most rampant users of corn and has seen their domestic demand for corn just skyrocket over really in the post-COVID years. So as you can see, this is just this graph's just fit to the 5-year average, about to 90% explanation. If we shift that up with the pace thus far, that would give you an idea of maybe a curve to look at. Obviously, the farther we get out here into the March and May period, the less certain we are. But just to give an idea of kind of the strength thus far through the marketing year. Another reason for optimism, as I alluded to, for corn exports is the situation for corn outside of the U.S. and China remains on the tighter side. It is worth noting that the U.S. and China are far and away the largest stockholders of corn in the world, especially China. I mean, take it with a grain of salt because it's not necessarily a given what the USDA says for China's stocks. It's a well-kept secret, I would say, especially in terms of their state reserves. But that being said, if you add those two together, it's about 80% as of 2024-25 of what the USDA says is being held for corn stocks around the globe. 80% is held between the U.S. and China. So if you take those out of the equation, you have to go back several years. You have to go back to the early 2000s to find a stocks to use ratio is tight. So this is stocks of corn relative to the demand for corn around the world. You have to go back about 25 years or so to find a level as tight. And this puts the U.S. as a major stockholder of corn in a great position to be the supplier of corn to the countries in need. It is worth mentioning that this number, too, is assuming just below record production for corn in 2026 for Argentina as well as Brazil. I know John talked about that. I haven't added any specific charts for Brazil and Argentina simply because I believe we're just way too early, especially in Brazil. 70+% of Brazil's corn crop anymore is the safrinha corn crop. That will not even be planted until February and March as they harvest their soybeans. So it's just simply too early to say much with confidence about what the corn crop next year could be. I will say that I think John hit the nail perfectly on the head with the issues with their soil moisture. Certainly something to keep an eye on as we work into that February-March period, especially if it's looking detrimental still as they enter their dry period towards April and May. Could really catch some of that corn towards the tail end of its pollination, which is a reason for bullishness. But of course, we just won't know that with a high degree of confidence for some time yet. Looking at ethanol production around the U.S., worth noting that last week's ethanol production of 1.126 million barrels per day was a weekly record. It edged out the most recent record, which was the end of October, by 3,000 barrels per day. We are about just over 1% higher on ethanol production year over year. The USDA, meanwhile, is forecasting that corn usage for ethanol will increase 3% year over year. It unfortunately isn't a one-for-one. For example, last year we saw ethanol production year over year was about 3% higher from the previous season, but corn usage actually fell less than 1% on the year. So there's a lot of moving parts in that, namely the yield. How many gallons are you getting for a bushel of corn? Can vary from month to month and from plant to plant, of course. But as any indication, definitely a strong market for U.S. ethanol still, and a lot of incentive there for crushers and grinders to keep the pace up here for ethanol production. So tying that all together into the corn balance sheet, I'd just like to break down into a couple different scenarios just to give some ideas of what I think is possible as we move through the season. Of course, I am going to be using a little less yield. I'm going to go with 182. I'll tell you that my personal forecast was 179 prior to the November WASDE, so I don't think that's probably realistic at this point either. But 182 seems fair. We'll see what the USDA has to say in January. But anyway, as we move down here, that's going to, again, leave us with a record corn crop by about 1 billion bushels. So definitely bearish on the supply side. But as we move down to the demand side, I tend to err towards this blue side. I think our feed and residual number is one I'm very skeptical of thus far. I think it's maybe a placeholder. That 6.1 billion bushels would be the highest in 20 years, which for anyone who watched Shay Lee's presentation yesterday, not a whole lot of reason to expect a a sharp increase in fed cattle numbers anytime soon through this marketing season in my mind. So I'm a little skeptical of that number, but I do wonder, as I said, if it's a placeholder just for higher exports. I wouldn't be shocked to see the export number, if this current pace is any indication, be even higher than what the USDA is saying. So I plugged in a 3.4 billion bushels. Again, not saying that'll necessarily be true, but I think it gives us a good forecast of maybe where the total demand will sit, just under 16 billion bushels. That would be a record as well. Would push our carryout down to, I'm going to call it between 1.8 and 1.9 to 2 billion bushels. I do think before it's all said and done, we will fall back below the 2 billion bushel mark. I think the demand is simply too strong at these current prices, and we'll get a little bit of a pull down there in stocks that way. So that being said, I'm going to be operating here with between 11 and 12% stocks to use ratio. Seems like a fair assumption at this point in time. If we plug that into price options here, or price chances, I guess, I would like to just point out that, as you can see by the R squared value here in the top right corner, only 62% of the variation in corn prices on a month-to-month basis since 2007 can be explained by U.S. stocks to use alone. So it's not a perfect one-to-one. But that being said, you can see the red dot there. That is the November monthly close for the DTN National Corn Index. As you can see, it's right towards what I would consider the historical floor for any level of corn supply. But in a perfect world, you would expect a corn price, using an 11 to 12% stocks to use, probably in the $5 range. Seems to be historically where all those would kind of average out, and it's indicated by the red trend line. Time will tell. Obviously, prices tend to be anchored by whatever occurred the previous year. But in my mind, we do have the potential here to maybe start seeing some upward pull through the post-harvest rally back towards the convergence of those two arrows. So something to keep an eye on. It's still, again, there's a lot of variation, a lot of stuff that happens outside of just stocks to use that influences corn prices. But if stocks to use is any indication, I still think we're on the underpriced side, as this chart would maybe indicate. This kind of tells the same story here. This is just an inflation-adjusted corn price distribution going back to 1980. This is monthly futures closes that this captured. So basically, this just telling us where those arrows are pointing is the 450 mark for a monthly close. We're, of course, just a touch below that now on the March 2026 board. So only 24% of corn most active futures closes have fallen below 450 when adjusting for inflation since 1980. It tells me that historically we're still on the inexpensive side for corn prices, as we all know. As we look ahead, you can see that it doesn't take long through a rally, though. Up to $5 and beyond, you start to get into that 50% range. So beyond that, you can see that this curve really flattens out. That's where you really have to have a bullish situation to get, it's really slow going to grind your way to $7.50, $8 as history would show. The slide kind of between 450 and 5, a little easier, a little more vertical of a jump there. And then we starts to be a little harder to rally from then on. So still seems like the $5 mark is a reasonable target still at this point, I would say, for any kind of post-harvest rally. Just to give you some targets, I'll be looking kind of at the 470 level first. If we were to get to 470, 480, I'll kind of be reevaluating at that point to see where to go from there. But just some targets that I'm keeping circled on my chart anyway. As we move forward here, for anybody with corn in the bins looking for an opportunity to price, the good news is that we're getting out of the period where you would typically find your cash lows. Of course, that is September and October. September is a weird month. You can also capture some highs in September. There's a lot of risk with that because September is kind of a pivot point of course, as you move from one marketing year to another, it captures a lot of when you have big multi-year downtrends like we just came out of, it captures a lot of noise. So, if you want to hold your corn till September and roll the dice, more power to you. But a lot of risk for my taste in that month. But as we move forward, as you would expect, your May, June, and July marks kind of your sweet spot for hitting your crop year highs more often than not. It is worth noting, though, that we did hit our high, as mentioned earlier this week on Tuesday at 407. December has hit that high for the crop year just once since 1997. So that tells me that we're probably heading towards a higher cash price somewhere in this period, whether it's February, March, most likely in May, June, July, if it follows a typical pattern. So this is something to keep in your back pocket here. Seasonality is one of the strongest and most reliable tools we have as marketers to kind of fall back on. Definitely would encourage using this when planning your marketing program here for the 25, 26 and beyond marketing years. Jumping now to soybeans. Soybean production here, soybean profitability here. Similar situation that we've been seeing as compared to corn as well. It seems like the 20% below or so mark, again, seems like a historical floor going back. Again, the Asian recession years towards the end of the 1990s were particularly tough. But it does feel like thus far for this marketing season, we're starting to, again, thanks to that really strong rally at the end of October, it's turning the corner. We've set a low thus far, and our high thus far has been 10% below the USDA cost of production. That would be on par with what we observed going back to 2023, where of course we were in a sharp downtrend in 2023, heading down from the 2022 highs of the post-COVID rally. Looking at the soybean production here, kind of the same exercise as we did on corn. Always like to look at the USDA percent errors, 3.5% plus or minus to get to a 90% confidence. In the November WASDE report, USDA said 80.3 million acres. That was about a decade low for soybean acres and a 53 bushel per acre yield, which would be a record above, I believe, 2016 was the previous record at 52 bushels per acre. Leaves us with just about 4.25 billion bushels of production. If you do that exercise, plus or minus 3.5%, it seems like we'll most likely be sitting between a 51 bushel per acre yield and 55. I will say, coming into the November report, I was using a 54. Again, I was a little surprised the plot reports we'd heard through the Midwest were higher on yield than I would have anticipated, especially with how hot and dry it was across the eastern belt to end the summer. So I think 53 is perfectly reasonable, maybe even a touch lower. But, the January report can bring surprises. I wouldn't be shocked if we found it's a little higher either to 54. Either way, we're going to be sitting with a little less production year over year as compared to 2024 soybean harvest. And that's mainly to do with that low acreage. I'd also like to just, while we're on the slide, point out this 16% margin of error on U.S. exports. We'll want to keep that number in mind. I'm going to use that number later here on a later slide when we start talking about the export program. But first, before that, I got to start with the domestic crush program. This is kind of the shining star, is what I like to call it, of the soybean complex. It's just impressive year over year. It's a record setter year over year, and there's really no reason to believe 25, 26 is going to be any different. And NOPA crush through October is certainly indicative of that. We are 13% higher for the marketing year versus the same point in 2024. USDA is only assuming a 4.5% increase in crush in 2025-26. So I did a quick forecast using a mix of data. Again, due to the government shutdown, we don't have the most recent USDA data. But when I ran just a very simple seasonal based forecast, I got 2.632 billion bushels of soy crush for the U.S. in 25-26. So seems reasonable to me to expect. I think the USDA is reasonable as well, but right now the pace is certainly showing that we have the potential to even be better than what the USDA is showing. Excuse me. It's been truly remarkable aspect of the soybean complex in my mind is what we've been able to accomplish in terms of crushing, and it's really, I think, something to watch in the long run. For the U.S. might not have the capability even to get back to exports that we saw in the 2021, 2022 type years. So something to keep an eye on here as we move forward. Looking at soybean exports, We are well below pace, of course, on shipments. Sales may be a little bit of a different story. We're, of course, behind pace on sales data. So this is the same exercise as what I did in corn, basically just trying to fit a trend to what has occurred thus far and forecast out what might occur. Now, I'd like to point out this model zeroes it out May, June, and July. That, of course, isn't going to happen. Most likely, this is just where you don't know. I mean, you look out that far on a forecast, you just don't know with a whole lot of confidence what's going to happen. It wouldn't shock me, given that China is the main buyer in this area and the main importer. It wouldn't surprise me if this is other buyers throughout the world, and maybe this just looks normal. Maybe this dotted red line is flat from March forward. Maybe China goes to Brazil in March, as you'd expect, and this is flat. And in that case, that would make our export program look a lot much better than a chart like this indicates. So always, this is just kind of a word of warning. Always, when you see a metric like this or a chart, always ask questions. Always be skeptical. And I built this, and I'm even openly skeptical of some of the findings of models. You can't take everything at face value, and what's going on here is simply, I'll be the first to admit, not going to happen. But it's just, you don't have a good idea at this point what could happen. Could be normal, could be slightly below. Definitely won't be zero on total exports. But either way, it's a concerning pace thus far. We're well behind the same point in 2025, 26 as we were in 2024, 46% behind on inspections to be exact. The good news is China has returned as a buyer, and we'll jump into that here in more detail. And that I titled as the elephant in the room. This is probably what a lot of people are talking about. Obviously, it takes up the headlines almost daily. And so I just think, especially this time of year, it's good to just sit back. There's obviously a lot of opinion, a lot of one way or the other when it comes to China's place in the world soybean market and the U.S.'s place in terms of China's demand. But I like to sit back and just refresh myself by doing the math. So I thought it'd be a good, worthwhile exercise to do that with everybody watching. So basically, this chart is just showing the orange bars are, and this is according to China customs data, what percent of their total yearly take from October to October is accomplished in each month. So of course, you can tell it totals and sums to 100%. So by end of September of 2026, they will have taken their fill of soybeans over the next 12 months. The blue bars are the monthly percent of share that usually comes from the U.S. This is a 5-year average seasonality. So if we look at what the USDA is saying will occur and do the math, in my mind, there's reason for some optimism. So the USDA is assuming 112 million metric tons of imports from China. Typically, 42% of that, so 42% by March, would occur by March. So that'd be 48 million metric tons. But we have to remember the U.S. has missed out on October and November, so this is gone. We're December 1st. The first Chinese boats are in the U.S. loading, I believe, this week or next week. So we're starting to actually ship some of these sales. But that's going to be about, I forecasted or estimated to be about 18 million metric tons. So that leaves in my mind 30 million metric tons of soybeans that China is going to have to take between December and March. If you look at the typical seasonality, I rounded it to 50%. You could argue it's somewhat higher than that even. But 50% of that usually goes to the U.S. I'm a little conservative on that just because we are seeing Argentina ramp up their business with China on raw soybeans in a way that's been rare. Usually Argentina is more of a products market. But that being said, that leaves me with 15 million metric tons or 550 million bushels. Now, the U.S. goal, according to the trade summit between President Xi and President Trump at the end of October, was 12 million metric tons of purchases by the end of 2025. And according to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, that's now been extended to February. So in my mind, this number isn't an accident. That 12 million metric tons isn't an accidental number. That's a very intentional number by the Chinese in my mind. They know exactly what they're typically going to need to take to bridge the gap between December and their arrival of Brazilian beans in March and April. So 550 million bushels. Yes, that's less than what we've expected in recent years, but it's certainly not the doomsday scenario that has been painted through the early fall period. So, I kind of argued on the previous slide the bearish points. This would be definitely an argument towards the bullish points here as we move forward. Another reason for bullishness is this, that, historically there remains a gap between what the USDA has said that South America can provide the world on exports, and the green line also includes other fringe exporting countries such as Russia, Canada. Obviously, you can see that's a very small piece of the pie, but we've actually seen you could argue it's slightly growing. The gap over time that must be filled from somebody, and the only viable option for volume is the USDA. So that gap right now is 1.62 billion bushels. So in my mind, we're currently at 1.635 as of the November WASDE. If the USDA decides to reduce that below that mark, they're going to have to explain why in the balance sheet. And most likely that's going to have to be the product of less imports on the world side. And of course, of this 180 million metric tons, 112 of that is China. So it most likely would be less Chinese imports, which, all rhetoric thus far through the fall would indicate that that's not the case. Some officials from China have said their appetite for soybeans has never been stronger. So right now, this gap right here keeps me optimistic that the U.S. has a place and always will have a place in the world soybean trade. As we look forward, though, this is certainly the area of concern. It's just continues to be never-ending upward sloping trend here in terms of the amount of soybeans planted in Brazil. CONAB is estimating over 120 million acres of soybeans to be planted in Brazil this season. That planting season is about 90% complete. It's over 99%, probably 100% complete in Mato Grosso, the top producing state in Brazil. So we continue to see, it seems like we constantly hear, oh, it's growing at its slowest rate in a decade. But, we saw that in and around 2010, then we saw it again around 2019, and we saw it again last year, and we just keep pushing that higher. So where the end is to this higher trend, I honestly couldn't tell you at this point. I'm sure some surveyors down there have an idea of what, in terms of the Cerrado, is still available. But I've heard it's just almost an endless pool of degraded pasture land that could be repurposed to farm land. Someone once, I'm from central Nebraska, someone once compared it to the Nebraska sandhills to me. I don't know the validity of that. I never checked. But someone did tell me once that they're like, imagine something the size of the Nebraska sandhills that could be planted all the soybeans. So take that with a grain of salt. If anyone knows for sure or has a better idea of where this could end, I'd be all ears. But for now, anyway, continues to point towards increasing acreage and production in Brazil. Of course, I haven't added a whole lot where, of course, very early in the growing season, there, as John alluded to, there are reasons for concern. It's been very dry, very hit or miss rainfall thus far. Feels like December might be a little bit better. They're starting to get a little bit better coverage. So I did hear some murmurings of some replant having to occur through the month of November, but time will tell on the long-term consequences there, if there are any. Looking at the soybean balance sheet, just like to give a couple of different options again, and I would just like to point out this green column is kind of it's just an exercise, so don't go out and say, oh, Rhett from DTN said we're going to have less than 100 million bushels of soybean stocks at the end of 25-26. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I just wanted to give a comparison, and it's mainly to illustrate that we simply don't have the supply due to this low acreage number to even get back to the 1.8, 1.9 level of exports. I raised the exports here just for fun and games and experiment to 1.76, and with what I think crush could do, that drops our stocks to that'd be the lowest going back to the drought years, 2012 type numbers. So probably not a realistic expectation for this year. unless we have an issue and a huge issue in Brazil and China turns in a heavy way back to U.S. beans. So I guess you can't rule anything out this early. Um, as I mentioned, there is a 16% margin of error in the USDA's estimates in November. But if you added that 16% to this number, the 1.635, it takes you beyond the realm of possibility in my mind. So that is, again, a potential bullish argument for the soybean complex moving forward. Now, on the other side here, again, I've already stated my case for why I think this isn't possible either at less than 1.4 billion bushels. That pushed your stocks back up towards the 500 million mark. But again, we're most likely going to fall in between here somewhere, I would expect. Again, the crush, though, the amount of beans we're using domestically, there just isn't going to be the capability to get back to a level we saw in 2024 and 25. So right now at 290 million bushels, the USDA, I think is fairly accurate with where we may be sitting here through the 25-26 soybean marketing. Looking at what that could mean for soybean prices, kind of the same situation as corn when you boil it down to a trend. Again, this is even less explanation than we saw in corn, only 49% of the variation on a month-to-month basis, but still would suggest that we are towards the lower end of price potential given where the stocks to use are. We're under 7% now on U.S. stocks to use. A lot of this upward momentum, though, will depend on what the Brazilian crop ends up looking like. So it's going to be, as John said, a very important couple of months here, beginning in December, but really as we turn into January and February and start to see some pod fill. If there's any issues there, that's where you really, in my mind, get the upside momentum in soybean prices. This is the same kind of thing we looked at as corn. 27% of the monthly closes have fallen below $11. We are just above $11 on the most active contract, which is the January 2026 contract. But we've been having trouble at 11.50. That would be just over 30%. So still, in the grand scheme, in the lower echelon of what's been observed when adjusting for inflation for prices. So it keeps me optimistic that there's probably a lot of technical driven support at prices down back towards the 10.50 level. Looking at the seasonality in soybeans, again, September is kind of a weird month, but here as we move forward, December, due to the weather in Brazil, has potential to be a bit of a bear as well. But as we turn the corner into the 2026 season, you get a lot more opportunities of hitting the high for the crop year than hitting the low. Again, your May, June, July period is kind of your sweet spot. That's just under 40%. If you want to add in August, it goes over 50%. But as you can see, August is a very risky month to store a soybean to, over 25%. Since 1997 of your crop year lows have occurred in August. So August, September, probably a period to avoid, of course, with October in there as well. May, June, July for hedging seems to be the sweet spot, as we know, based on the seasonality of row crops in the U.S. Lastly, with wheat, I have a little less on wheat. It's just a pretty easy market to explain right now with some of the supply going on. But starting on the U.S. balance sheet, I only gave one scenario here. The big takeaway from the U.S. balance sheet right now is that, despite the historically low acreage and despite what felt like a tough growing season at points, we still came out with the largest total wheat crop in 9 years in 2025. The all wheat yield is a record at this point. So really just a very impressive production given where we were sitting at conditions this time last year. It felt like we were really going to be in a tough situation with the drought across the U.S. There's a decent level of drought now across winter wheat areas. It has been alleviated somewhat in the last few weeks, but that being said, I just think this is why we fail to see the upside momentum right yet as of the fall of 2025. Is I think traders are very cautious of getting ahead of themselves given the really drought defying yields we saw across the globe, whether it be Russia, Australia. It seems like we had instances of concerning dryness in a lot of places that just at the end of the day didn't seem to stop the production or trim production in any way. So I do think, and we'll talk about this in more detail, I do think there's potential for more exports. I see it as being very similar to last year in terms of ending stocks, probably very similar in terms of price action as well as we move through this season. Looking at weekly wheat exports, this has been a silver lining, the shining star, if you want to put it that way. As you can see, we've had a really impressive amount of variability week to week in the amount of wheat we're sending out of the U.S. But overall, we're averaging to above the 5-year average. And the good news is typically you hit your seasonal low really around this time, and we start to trend higher as we move out of November and into the new year before flattening out ahead of the new crop. So this is a good thing to see that we're setting that anchor there a little bit higher than you would traditionally. Keeps me optimistic that the trajectory should remain strong as we move forward. That being said, commitments as of October 30th were up 22%. Of course, we are behind schedule on that due to the government shutdown, but inspections were up 20% as well. So everything pointing right now to a very strong start for the first half of the wheat marketing year, which began in June. USDA is expecting a 9% increase in wheat exports. So that's seeming a little light at this point. We'll see if the USDA decides to touch that up in the December WASI report due out next week. If the wheat market could be summed up in one chart for 2025, this would certainly be it. I would also point out that Canada, as of this morning's Statistics Canada report, is going to be closer to the 20 to 25% above the 5-year average mark. Their wheat production for 2025 was pegged at a record 40 million metric tons in Canada. That was about 2 to 3 million metric tons higher than the average trade estimate for that report this morning. So truly remarkable to look back, though, at the past 14 crops. So going back to the Ukrainian crop in 2024, it's just been above average production for everybody except Ukraine. Ukraine, obviously, we know why Ukraine is struggling to produce what they maybe produced in 2021 and 2020 is, they're, to be put it frankly, they're losing area due to the ongoing invasion from Russia. So take them out as an anomaly, a geopolitical anomaly. And it's just, there's been very little reason for concern on the supply side when it comes to wheat. This kind of illustrates the same point. As you can see, we were, consistently trending above demand, or demand above production. This recent push in production, though, we're now sitting at a surplus again. So more production than anticipated world domestic usage for wheat here in 25-26 could potentially keep the top end on price potential as we move forward, just as there's just simply a surplus of wheat around the globe. Looking at price potential here for wheat, we are definitely towards the bottom end of the spectrum here. We're hanging out right above the $5 mark, between $5 and $5.50. This keeps me very optimistic that $5 is likely a long-term technical floor. We saw Kansas City wheat futures, dip below $5 in the last recent months. They went as low as the 470s, but I think those areas are areas that traders see as opportunities to be buyers. So I'm optimistic that that's a long-term floor, and potentially a lot more upside potential than downside potential, I would say. But that being said, certainly a lot of supply will keep the lid on the potential for prices as we move through 2026, in my mind. Just to sum it up here, just some takeaways here that I would like to offer up as my best shot at advice here would be to use the seasonal tendencies to your advantage. A basis contract is one example of this. A basis contract is a great tool because it allows you to ship early. You're reducing quality risk doing that. And then you can work orders to sell at seasonal highs. We also have, seasonally very tight spreads as well. So you can ride a basis contract now against a deferred futures month, buy yourself a little bit of time to price, and the spread adjustment on your basis isn't going to be as drastic as you'd maybe see where the carries stronger than they are right now. Disciplined sales, nothing wrong with 5%, 5 to 10%, excuse me, of a crop at a time. I like this because it allows you to be flexible, especially for times when seasonality fails us. It's like last year where we set our high in February for corn, something that had rarely been done before. If you're very disciplined with your sales, it allows you to mold your marketing plan to those fast changes in seasonality and adjust quickly. Of course, that's not going to you're not going to hit the high doing that, but you're also not going to hit the low. And sometimes marketing is as much about keeping off the low as it is hitting the high. Also, I'd encourage to talk to your grain buyer about special contracts such as a min-max or a hedge and a long call, options that allow you to sell the grain now, but also stay in the market should the rallies continue here. It's especially useful at seasonal highs. You can usually lock your hedge in among the high, pay a small fee. If we keep going, at least keeps you in the market. If we don't, you're only out the cost of that participation. So, and then above and beyond that, look for deferred opportunities for 2026 and beyond. Maybe you're not right at this moment, but if the market gives us an opportunity for 2025's crop in the first months of 2026, or maybe in the May or June period, don't ignore the deferred boards. Look out at those deferred boards, December 2026, March 2027, and see what the prices are. See if they work for your operation, and don't be afraid to start easing into sales there as well to take a little bit of risk off on your deferred book as well. And with that, that is all I have for today. I thank you again for joining us. And as Katie and John said, and as Shaylee alluded to yesterday, I would just like to say, we're always available. I would like anybody here to take a screenshot of my email here. I love hearing, questions, critiques, sometimes especially critiques. If there's something in this presentation you just simply didn't agree with, I always like to hear why. I like to know what's going on at the grassroots level. The numbers and graphs and all are all fun. It's something I really enjoy. But at the end of the day, it's whether it's useful to those at the field level that makes what we do at DTN worthwhile. So with that, I'll turn it back to Katie, and we'll, of course, take some questions right now.
Thanks, Rhett. That was really interesting. I learned some things from listening to you that I had not known before. And I want to welcome John back in with us all. We are ready for the question and answer portion of our event. I do see we have one question in the queue. Please add some more. Like I said yesterday, if you guys don't give questions, it's more time for me, and I'm happy to ask questions. That's a thing that I do. It is part of my job and part of my favorite parts. These two are usually on the receiving end of my questions. So they would like to hear from someone else too. I'll start with the one we have in the queue, Rhett, and this one says, I know it's a little bit outside your area of expertise, but you have any thoughts on cotton and rice now and into the 2026 crop year?
Yeah, so I mean, cotton was an interesting one last year with the historically low acreage. I guess in my mind, in terms of turning the page towards the acreage of cotton as we move forward, it's really going to depend on, and John could speak to this too, in terms of the instances of soil moisture as we get to the March period. I found that if you get to March and there's instances of widespread drought in Texas, particularly, it seems like you see a bigger shift away from corn to cotton. Cotton tends to have a higher drought hardiness to it. Last year, it seemed like we were starting to see that kind of shift away. And I think that's where we saw that big shift even more towards corn last year, which ultimately was, pushed us towards the 98 million mark. History would tell you that when you have a big low in acreage, you tend to revert back towards the trend or the mean. Cotton acreage, of course, in the U.S. is on a sharp down curve historically. And that's just a testament to the industry, the advent of artificial fabrics and the rise of Brazil as a huge cotton producer as well. So in the long term, it's hard to argue with history that we're probably going to most likely continue to see a decline in cotton acreage in the U.S. But that being said, it's not perfectly linear. Usually when you have a big drop, you tend to have a correction the next year. So it wouldn't shock me, especially given, some of the tough situation for corn this year, if we see some of that acreage switch back to cotton. as we turn into 2026. Again, I think that'll be a lot of that will depend on what the soil moisture situation looks like in Texas, and then on the rice side of things, I'm definitely not the person, the world's authority on rice. The one thing that I'll be interested to see is definitely how the U.S. fits moving forward with some of the trade agreements we've signed in the last month or so with some of these countries in Southeast Asia. I mean, obviously, when you think of Asia, obviously big producing countries of rice in that area, but there are some areas there as well, some countries that are looking for possible imports. So I think that keeps the U.S. a compelling option, definitely on the demand side for rice.
What's the weather looking like in those parts of the country, John, for next year?
Well, yeah, I mean, Texas specifically could be a really interesting state. And, I kind of alluded to the fact that during La Ninas, usually Texas and the Southern Plains in general are drier and hotter than normal over the winter. So that would tend to lead to more drought development. So we'll see if that's actually going to happen or not. Because what I also mentioned was the forecast track is preferred from Texas up in the Northeast as well. So it's a weird dichotomy where the eastern half of Texas could end up in better position. I mean, that's not usually where we think about the biggest, cotton producers. Those are out in West Texas. But if it does end up drier out there, that could be interesting to see if more folks tend to go to cotton over corn. Because last year it wasn't the case at all. I mean, they had a whole bunch of rain during the spring, and it was like Rhett mentioned there. I mean, there was no reason not to plant corn because they had the soil moisture, and that continued through most of the season for them. So it was okay for them. But if they are a little bit more pessimistic on their soil moisture, yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see if cotton makes a little bit more of a comeback this year. As far as across the South, again, it's an animal that tends to lead to drier conditions because of La Nina. But once we get into the spring and that's gone, that variability could definitely lead to some decent acreage there. The more interesting thing to me, honestly, is not what's happening domestically, but what's going on internationally, specifically Brazil. And Rhett mentioned Brazil. It was great that he did. Because last year I went and talked to the cotton ginners, the Mid-South cotton ginners, and they're specifically concerned about what's going on in Brazil. And I specifically talked about soybeans going to corn, but the safrinha crop is both cotton and corn. And we talk a lot more about corn just because that's kind of our main focus, but it's a big cotton area too. So I mean, they can keep expanding their acres for soybeans, they can keep expanding their acres for cotton as well. And that's become quite the rival on the world stage. So it's interesting to see in that kind of area of the world too, where we're a little bit more concerned about things getting drier later on into 2026 if folks don't say, maybe I won't plant the corn this year, maybe I'll plant cotton. So that'll be, I think, a little interesting nugget to watch as well.
And the only thing I'd add to the cotton and rice conversation is that among my travels this fall, I've talked to a number of people who are maybe towards the Arkansas side of production where they grow rice and cotton and soybeans, and that financially that area is really struggling because the prices for all of those crops have been depressed and have been for a long time. So there's really not a more profitable option out there, especially given some of the trade disruptions that are in there. Okay, I have a couple of more in the queue. And let's see, the first one is from Kent. He says, any news on Canadian canola being accepted into the USA biofuel market and any China-Canada trade resolution on the canola tariff?
Yeah, so to begin with the biofuel piece, that's I usually like to put a slide in my presentation about it, but I opted not to just because it feels like such a moving target through 2025 with the policies ever shifting. It seems like the really to a domestic biofuel producer really friendly news in June is long gone history at this point. that really, of course, had sent the U.S. soybean oil market screaming higher through June and July. But in terms of for imported feedstocks to make biofuels, the big question is when that policy of basically the target is for a 50% RIN production or deduction, excuse me, if a biofuel is made with a foreign feedstock. I think that's more of a target towards Chinese used cooking oil, to tell you the truth. I would anticipate when all the legislation is decided on and the policies are decided on by the EPA that Canadian canola is probably going to be exempt from that under the trade agreement whenever they redo USMCA. So we'll keep an eye on it. But other than that, I think the main kind of drag on the Canadian canola market right now is certainly the ongoing anti-dumping electric car spat that's going on with between Canada and China. So, the trade war between the U.S. and China in regards to soybeans gets obviously a lot of headlines, but it's certainly a pain point to a lot of Canadian producers as well. As I think the last weekly statistics report showed like 48% below normal exports for canola, and this morning's report showed a record canola yields as well, which is a bit of a surpriser considering how, again, a really shaky start to the growing season in Western Canada through 2025, but gave way to really good conditions by the end and ended up being really good for production. So it feels like we're turning the corner there to what felt like a very tight situation for canola stocks last year. Feels like we're turning that corner now to a little bit more of a surplus. But that being said, I'm confident that the U.S. will continue to be a home for the majority of Canadian canola oil. Of course, the seed is another story with the China deal. But I think the growing boom of desire to make biofuels across the world, it's just going to pull things in a certain direction. So if we get into a situation like it's looking like it might be this year, where the U.S. is going to export more soybean oil than we simply can afford to do, given what we're anticipating needing to make biofuels, well, then that has to be backfilled somewhere. And it seems like Canadian canola oil is a great way to backfill, shortfalls when you maybe get a little bit ahead of yourself and end up exporting a little bit more soybean oil than we maybe should, considering where our stocks are and where the demand is. So it's all constantly shifting dynamics in world trade. But I think the bottom line and the line drivers that whether it's in the U.S., Europe, or Asia, the demand for biofuels is just skyrocketing the last 5 or so years and continues to do so.
And we've got a follow-up question on that, Rhett. There's something very related to that. So what's your viewpoint on the expansion of sustainable aviation fuel, renewable diesel, and how much more of U.S. soybeans could that development take?
Yeah, so again, the political side is a very much a moving target still. It seems like the EPA is caught between wanting to obviously please the Farm Belt states, which are, of course, to the current administration, a very important part of the voter base, as we all know, but also has an oil aspect to that to keep in mind as well. So it seems like this whole time the EPA has been kind of caught between trying to appease the oil refiners in the U.S., but also those who are advocates, of course, for the usage of corn or farm commodities for the production of biofuels. But that being said, the crush program in the U.S. for soybeans continues to point towards nothing but higher. And I think regardless of the bottom line government, where the EPA finally settles this out in terms of small refinery exemptions, renewable fuel standard volumes. Right now, the data would show that, we continue to build plants, we continue to push the production higher and higher. I think in the last 12 years, we've only failed to set a new crush record twice in the past 12 years or so. So we just continue to expand that. And right now, until I see more reason to believe that we're hitting a ceiling, I just continue to think we're going to to push that higher. And I think the EPA's initial rulings or guidelines in June really point towards they want to. They're not, anti biofuels by any stretch. I think they want to come up with something very friendly, but they also want to work with the oil side as well. And I think that's where the EPA earlier this year told the oil people and the farm advocates to get together, and they really were encouraging collaboration there. And I think that's a great start to the conversation, as we have to find a middle ground within that. And then to tie it all together with the sustainable aviation fuel, that's unfortunately, as everything I can tell as far as without the tax credits, it just doesn't really work in terms of being a long-term solution for a lot of these airliners. That one, more so than just the renewable diesel, to me is very sensitive to the political support, because unless there's a per gallon tax break for the buyer, the prices right now, at least the last time I checked, just didn't really pencil compared to just conventional aviation fuel. So it'll be interesting. I think there's a lot of obviously political landscape to iron out, but I'm optimistic on where soybeans fit in, to say the least.
Mm-hmm. A lot of parallels there with the sustainable aviation fuel in the early days of the ethanol industry and getting that up and off the ground.
Yeah,
The need for those tax credits in the beginning.
Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah. All right. Next question is for you, John. Kent has asked, what's the estimated time La Nina will transition to neutral?
Well, it's actually really close right now, honestly. And looking at some of the winds that are going on over the next couple of weeks, probably going to happen where we probably by the end of the month, by the time we cross back over that minus 0.5, because we're at a minus 0.6 right now. It doesn't take a whole lot to move that other direction. But there is a big giant pool of cold water out there now. And the warm water that I was talking about moving in is going to take a couple months to actually do that. So we might stick in this for another few weeks, but trying to put like a last end date on it sometime in January. So it should be rather quick. And so, I mean, once it does, I mean, it's not like an immediate thing. Once it crosses that line, all of a sudden things change. But we should see a gradual shift then during the month of January, especially in February, where the pattern goes from being one that's particularly colder to one that is more tolerable. Maybe not for you, Kent, up there in the prairies, or even me in Minnesota. We're probably going to stick in the cold air for a while. But that shift should be more noticeable across the U.S. By the time we get into February.
And that La Nina usually means dryness in Brazil. And when you showed those long-term charts of Brazilian weather and the precipitation forecast, it looked like it was pretty far below normal as far as whatnot. But as you've explained before, sometimes that's a little bit deceiving simply because of the amount of rainfall Brazil gets. So do you see this dryness we have really impacting those yield potential for beans, or is it really much more of a safrinha impact?
I think it's honestly going to be more of a safrinha impact. Yeah. I mean, when you average 8 to 12 inches per month and you get 2 inches less, or you only get 75% of your normal rainfall, you still got 6 inches of rain in a month. That's a ton of rain for filling beans. It's not bad. So, I mean, sure. I mean, the soil texture and everything and quality isn't like it is here in the U.S., specifically in the Corn Belt. But when you got 6 inches of rainfall in a month, you're doing all right. So yeah, it shouldn't be much that the bigger issue is can they keep up the soil moisture, because I mean, it's so low right now, and if they're just turning it on here in December, I mean, they're going any stretch of dryness is going to induce massive heat. And when it's not, I mean, they're so close to the equator, when it's not raining and the sun's out, it's over 100 degrees. So that's obviously a point of stress for anything living down there. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can still happen, even if the wetter conditions are turning out, and even if it's drier than normal. I never like to look at the
the anomalies, the deviations from normal, and make blanket statements about it. Because just because you're getting below normal moisture doesn't mean you're getting, not enough rainfall. And you could have the exact reverse thing happen too, where you get enough rainfall, but uh, hey, our soil moisture was garbage coming into this, and so we might have some issues going forward. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that kind of go into it, rather than just looking at a couple of maps. Yeah, I guess that's a long, complicated way to say that we got to just keep watching things and seeing, all right, is it coming at a consistent time period? Are they able to actually build their soil moisture over the next couple of months? If not, probably won't be a soybean thing, but could be. It'll be more likely a safrinha, cotton, and especially corn issue going forward.
And that reminded me of the chart that Rhett showed that showed the estimated stocks to use in the world when you take China and the US out of it. Because Brazil does grow a pretty large corn crop, right, Rhett? But a lot of that goes to their export market.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. And yeah, and that's I was just going to say that's really to me the key piece here is the prices in Brazil continue to be elevated. I think right now, if you translate it to a U.S. dollar, it's about 580 or so for a bushel of corn in Brazil right now, and we really saw that ramp up ahead of their planting in 2025, and we saw producers down there throw more and more late acres into the safrinha crop, and that's really the yields for the corn obviously aren't up to U.S. Levels. That's as John alluded to, a lot of that's due to climate. Some of it's due to just the soil profile in general. But I would say the main driver of that, rush is more domestically driven than anything more than, I know it gets a lot of headlines that Brazil is, seeking and I'm sure they are looking for buyers of their corn like any exporting country is, but it's really the domestic demand both on the feed side, the ethanol side, that's keeping those domestic corn prices elevated and really incentivizing the production, and a lot of acreage being thrown out. The CONAB is anticipating I think it's about a 3 to 5% increase in corn acreage again in February and March. Of course, like I said, most of that crop is the safrinha crop. So February and March before we even get it planted. So it's really hard to speak to the production potential right now. But as John alluded to, there are reasons to be optimistic that we could have some issues down the curve as that crop is pollinating. And as that chart alluded to, even with a steady to just below record level production in Argentina and Brazil, we're still sitting at 20-year lows when you take the U.S. and China out of that equation. And China's another, just to tack this on, China's another aspect that I don't think it's a foregone conclusion necessarily that China couldn't become an exporter of corn again. I mean, it's rare that we've seen that. We'll have to keep an eye on China's domestic prices. They have been relatively suppressed, like most crop prices around the world this year. But China's corn stocks, according to the USDA, are at a decade low as of the November WASDE as well. And one of the sharpest year-over-year declines, a 20 million metric ton decline from last year to this year is what's being forecasted. So I think that's the sharpest year-over-year decline since 2007 or 2008. I can't remember for sure, but so something to keep an eye on, and that could really turn this thing on its head too if China suddenly becomes a world importer of corn again, which is something we'd never seen until post-COVID, and we haven't seen since. But definitely not ruling it out, as it feels like their production in China has really hit a plateau. It seems like it's 140 million metric tons pretty much year in and year out. They never really drift much lower than that or much higher, but it's also you also have to be skeptical, as I alluded to that information as well. It might not be the most reliable thing the USDA puts out, but that's why I always would encourage to look at the prices, see if the prices are telling you. And right now, we're maybe starting to see the corner turn on Chinese corn values, so we'll be keeping an eye on that.
And we do carry those Chinese corn prices from there and soybean prices from the Dalian Exchange on our ProfitX products. And that's one
Yeah.
great way to really track what's going on in China.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a whole tab on ProfitX dedicated to Brazil's prices, China's prices, pretty much any price around the world I can find. And sometimes it's helpful to just keep it in the original currency too. Don't even let the exchange rate noise in. Can really give you a better picture of what's really going on. Like I said, I love the charts for all these fundamental aspects, but really, you really only need the price action to really tell you what's going on. And the market's more often than it's wrong for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I see a couple of more questions in here, and I have one more I want to get to as well. We'll start with this one. It says, if USA's cost of production is above current prices, who caves first, the producer or the buyer?
Let's see here. If I'm understanding the question right, I think so. I always kind of view things as, are we in a situation where the supply is chasing the demand, or is the demand chasing the supply, to put it that way? So right now, I think to get into a very bullish situation, you need a situation where you feel like the supply is trying to chase the demand. Unfortunately, I don't necessarily think we're there quite yet. It feels like our demand is still trying to catch up to our supply. That being said, our demand is very stellar, but I think if you look at USDA's estimates and take them for what they're worth. I know obviously a lot of people want nothing to do with USDA estimates. I think you have to have them as a benchmark. But even just ignoring the numbers in of themselves and just look at the kind of the levels in between those categories, as I kind of alluded to, it really feels like the USDA is inflating their feed and residual bucket right now, basically just assuming, okay, with this level of supply, we're going to have this much demand. We just don't know how to explain it yet. Which is perfectly fair this early. And I think their total demand assumption to be a record is perfectly fair, especially considering where our prices are historically, is certainly attracting a lot of buyers, especially as we've seen in these exports, buyers outside of the U.S. But that being said, I still think, given the supply we're potentially looking at, I still unfortunately think the buyer of grain maybe has a little bit more power than the supplier, which of course it's a lot more complicated than that, just in how widespread and futures markets work and how they're always clearing towards an equilibrium. But yeah, right now I view it more as we're trying to chase down this huge supply number with our demand, but as I kind of alluded to with China, that can flip in a hurry. All it takes is a kind of unforeseen event to flip that to where suddenly you maybe don't have the supply. On the soybeans, I will say we're a lot closer to the latter situation, where if this flips to where China, say Brazil has an issue on their soybeans and China says, well, we have to buy US beans in a big way, as that balance sheet kind of exercise I showed, we just don't have the supply to have that be possible. And that's where you get into a rationing situation where you say, okay, we can either crush 2.6 billion bushels domestically, or we can export, 1.8 billion bushels. We can't do both. And most likely your domestic users are going to be serviced first, as it probably should be. And so, that's going to keep your export program looking, weak historically, but really it's just a result of there not being the stocks to handle the demand. So we're a lot closer to that situation on soybeans. I'm hesitant to say we're there quite yet, but it'll be an interesting 3 months or so to see if we turn that.
And then I'm going to ask my question because it dovetails off that really well. And then I'll ask our remaining one in the queue. This is the time of year we've just wrapped up harvest. A lot of people are starting to make their plans for next year. And you mentioned on the cotton discussion, when acreage comes really low, it tends to bounce back. We saw a really low soybean acreage number this year. Where do you think it's heading for 2026 for corn, soybeans, and the mix?
Yeah, so I again, it's one of those things that modeling it this early is very difficult, and it's hard to get a high level explanation from any metric. I know the one that's really popularly used is the corn to or the soybean to corn price ratio. I particularly like to use the insurance ratio that we won't get, unfortunately, until February. But that being said, when I ran the model I keep on it 3 or 4 weeks ago, it gave me, and I know this will be off memory, so apologies, but it gave me like 94 million acres of corn, and I think it was around, see if I can remember this right, 84 million acres or so of soybeans. So it did have basically reverting back to the mean, essentially, is what the model was saying. And that was basically plugged off of profit. The only variable I had in there determining it was the profitability forecast for this fall, as well as the insurance, where I thought the insurance protection would be. So it seemed reasonable to me for a way too early forecast, to put it that way. We just don't know with a whole lot of confidence. But if I was going to place a bet this early, I would bet we probably see an edge down in the corn acreage and a little bit of a touch up in the soybean acreage, especially if we see this demand from China turn as a regular buyer again. If they honor their indications to buy a normal 25 million metric tons a year, then there's just no other way to put it. We'll need the supply, and the market's going to have to encourage more acreage, which I think it's starting to with this rally through the fall. And then, of course, how wheat and everything fits into that is another variable as well, which wheat most likely going to be another historical low, I would imagine, just with the difficulties in the prices there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, this one on wheat, or most likely to wheat. If the Ukraine-Russia war gets resolved, what's the impact likely to be on exports from that region?
I think the market reaction to any kind of peace news is certainly bearish, but honestly, I don't know if it has a huge impact in terms of the day-to-day business. It still seems like Ukraine obviously has had, as that wheat production chart illustrated, had their difficulties in maintaining production, and they've had to withhold stocks domestically to kind of bolster domestic supplies through fighting a war, essentially. So, but in terms of the actual port, it seems like the threats against ports that come and go, and then there's there have been strikes against ports, but there hasn't through this whole thing ever been something that's been hugely detrimental, especially for Russia. Russia continues to really drive the world export market. They're the world's largest exporter, and by a wide margin. So I think that if it does get resolved, it's probably more of a who concedes what territory, what wheat producing regions are now belong to Russia, what goes back to Ukraine. And then eventually you probably see Ukraine build back up into a more, steady state of being a competitor, I guess, to U.S. like we kind of saw them as prior to the invasion. So I think there maybe is something there, but to be honest, I haven't seen anything through the war thus far that's been totally alarming in terms of a huge, drop in any production or export potential. I think the wheat market's just pretty efficient, finds a way to get the supply to where it needs to go some way or the other.
All right, well, we are a little bit past our planned time. I want to give you each a chance, though, for some final thoughts, parting comments. I'll start with you, Rhett, and then we'll finish up with John.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us here today and yesterday as well. Good conversations as always from everybody. And I would just like to reiterate that our emails are, as Katie has said, publicly available. The conversations here, hopefully, I always tell my boss, Greg Horstmeyer, that when we do these, if it helps one person in the audience, with a decision they were maybe struggling to make, then it's certainly worthwhile to do. So I would just implore, if there aren't any questions or critiques or anything of that nature, feel free to shoot us an email. We're at least I'm at my computer probably an unhealthy amount of hours per day. So might as well be we all work for you at the end of the day. So might as well be doing that. So thank you again.
John?
Yeah, I guess I'd echo that, but send all the criticism to Rhett, and then I'll take all the praise.
You're the
And so just keep
weatherman.
that. Yeah, I know. I get plenty of criticism over that. Yeah, but I mean, I guess just to recap, expect a front-loaded winter and kind of a return to normal. And I'll put my air quotes up there for spring. We'll just have to see how that all plans out. In a couple of months, we'll have some better ideas, but at least through the winter, we've got some good confidence in what's going to happen here over the next couple of months.
All right. And that will be it for us for our DTN Ag Summit for December, planning for success. We hope this information has been useful and helpful to you. We are, like we said, you can read everything our team writes on dtnpf.com or any of our subscription products. They're all out there. The contact information for John, Rhett, and myself is usually on every single piece of every article and every story that we write. It's usually down there at the bottom. We do encourage comments and conversation with our readers and our viewers. And I hope that, at the end of the day, this has all been a worthwhile use of your time. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining us. Have a Merry Christmas and a prosperous New Year.